The void between the Velen Arm and the Orion Traverse was the kind of emptiness that made even seasoned spacers lose their nerve. And Captain Yethri Solen had been staring into it for 6 hours straight without blinking her second set of eyelids. She stood on the bridge of the Dawn Petal with her clawed hands locked behind her back and her feathered crest pressed flat against her skull, which was something her species did when they were trying very hard not to scream. The ship was dead in the water. Not dead exactly, Yethri corrected herself, because they still had lights and air and the soft hum of the backup power cells keeping them alive. But the thing that mattered most, the fold drive that could bend space and carry them across the stars in hours instead of decades, that was gone. Shattered into 1,000 pieces of exotic crystal scattered across the engineering bay like broken teeth. It had happened without warning, as the worst things always did. Yethri had felt the ship shudder beneath her feet, and heard the sound that no captain ever wanted to hear, a deep, grinding crack, followed by silence. The kind of silence that meant something fundamental had just stopped working forever. She had run to engineering and found chaos. 2 of her crew were on the floor bleeding, hit by shrapnel from the drive casing when it blew apart, and the rest of the engineering team was scrambling to contain a radiation leak that was painting the walls in colors no one should ever have to see. And young Lysick, the engineer, was standing in the middle of it all, with her forearms hanging limp at her sides, and her compound eyes wide and blank with shock. Lysick was a Kethvari, an insectoid species known for their brilliant minds and their tendency to freeze when reality became too terrible to process. And Yethri had grabbed her by the shoulders and shaken her until those compound eyes focused again. "Talk to me." And Lysick had talked, and everything she said was bad. The fold drive had not simply failed, it had suffered what Lysick called a cascading quantum fracture, which meant that the crystal matrix at the heart of the drive had cracked along every possible axis at once, and released its stored energy in a burst that was frankly a miracle it had not killed them all. And the drive could not be repaired, not with the tools they had, not with the materials on board, not with 100 engineers, and a year to work. They had sublight engines, the simple thrust-based kind that pushed a ship forward the old-fashioned way. But the nearest inhabited system was 14 years away at maximum burn. They did not have 14 years. Yethri had pulled Ruin aside after the initial crisis had been contained, and the injured crew had been moved to the medical bay, and the radiation leak had been sealed behind emergency bulkheads. Navigator to tell her the truth without softening it. Ruin was a Gorvathi, which meant he looked like someone had taken a bear and made it stand upright, and given it sad, wise eyes that had seen too many things. He towered over Yethri by a full meter, but somehow always managed to seem gentle despite his size. He had pulled up the star charts on his personal terminal and shown her what she already knew. They were in the dead corridor, a stretch of void so empty and so far from any trade route or patrol lane that it did not even have an official designation on most maps. Yethri had chosen to cut through it because the medical supplies in their cargo hold were needed desperately on a colony world where a plague was killing hundreds of people every day, and the shortcut would have saved them 3 days. 3 days that might have saved thousands of lives. Now those supplies would never arrive, and neither would they. Ruin had told her that life support would hold for 22 days if they reduced power consumption to emergency minimums, which meant cutting the heating to barely above freezing and shutting down every system that was not keeping them breathing. And the food stores would last perhaps 30 days if they rationed carefully. But none of that mattered, because they would run out of air before they ran out of food. Yethri had ordered the distress beacon activated. Every frequency they had, Galactic Council standard emergency channels, civilian bands, even the old deprecated military frequencies that nobody used anymore. And the beacon had begun to pulse its signal out into the darkness in every direction at the speed of light. But light was slow out here, and there was nothing to hear it. The crew knew because crews always knew, even when captains tried to hide the truth. And the fear had spread through the ship like a cold fog that settled into every corner and every conversation. Started doing the things that frightened people always did. Some praying, and some arguing, and some going very quiet, in a way that was worse than the arguing. There were 15 souls aboard the Dawn Petal, including Yethri herself, and 3 of them were children. The children belonged to Merchant Second Tovak and his partner Mian, a Velthari couple who had signed on for what was supposed to be a routine cargo run, and their 3 little ones were too young to understand what a broken fold drive meant, but old enough to sense that every adult around them was terrified, and they had gone quiet and clingy in the way that children did when the world stopped making sense. Yethri had knelt down and told them that everything was going to be fine, and that help was coming, and that they should try to sleep, and she had smiled as she said it, even though smiling felt like lifting a weight she could barely carry. Then she had gone back to the bridge and sat down in her captain's chair and watched the distress beacon pulse on her console, a tiny light blinking over and over again into the vast, uncaring darkness. She thought about the colony world where the plague was spreading, and the people who were waiting for the medicine in her cargo hold. And she thought about Tovok's children sleeping fitfully in the cold, and she thought about the 14 years of empty space between them and the nearest star. She thought about how strange it was that space could be so beautiful and so deadly at the same time, and how the stars that looked like diamonds scattered on black velvet from the observation deck were really just nuclear fires burning trillions of kilometers away, too far to warm anyone, too far to help. Ruin came to the bridge and stood beside her without speaking, because he was the kind of friend who knew when words were useless. And they sat together in the dim light of the emergency systems and listened to the soft, rhythmic ping of the distress beacon calling out to no one. No one was coming. Yethri knew this the way she knew the temperature of her own blood, with a certainty that went deeper than thought, because the math was simple, and the math did not care about hope or fear or the lives of 3 small children sleeping in the cold. The galaxy was very big, and they were very small, and the silence between the stars did not answer prayers. 48 hours into the crisis, the Dawn Petal had become a cold and frightened place, and Captain Yethri Solen could feel the hope draining out of her crew, the way warmth was draining from the walls. They had cut the heating to survival minimums, which meant the corridors were barely above freezing, and everyone was wearing every layer of clothing they owned. The Gorvathi crew members, with their thick fur, were sharing sleeping spaces with the smaller species, who shivered through the long hours between watch shifts. The 2 injured crew members were getting worse, and the one with radiation poisoning, a Gorvathi engineer named Brecht, had started vomiting blood in the night, while the ship's limited medical supplies did almost nothing to slow the damage eating through his cells. Lysick had performed a miracle of engineering by rerouting power from the cargo lighting and the water recycling backup systems, and the entertainment consoles, and everything else she could strip, and she had bought them perhaps 5 more days of breathable air. But she had told Yethri privately that she had reached the limit of what cleverness could do, and that after those 5 days, there was nothing left to cut except the things keeping them alive. The crew had gathered in the cargo hold because it was the largest open space on the ship, and because people who were frightened wanted to be near other people. And they sat among the crates of medical supplies that were meant to save a colony and might now never reach anyone. And they talked in low voices about the things people talked about when they thought they were going to die. Some of them prayed, each species in their own way, the Veltari pressing their crests to the floor and whispering to the Sky Mothers, the Gorvathi humming deep bass notes that vibrated in the chest, the Kethvari clicking their mandibles in mathematical patterns they believed contained the voice of the universe. argued about whose fault it was, and whether the shortcut had been worth the risk, and whether the captain should have known the drive was going to fail. And Yethri let them argue because anger was better than despair, and because some of what they said was fair. And then a young Valthari deckhand named Oshai, who was barely old enough to have his adult feathers, said something that made everyone stop talking at once. What about the humans? The silence that followed was heavy and strange, and Yethri watched the reactions ripple across the faces and bodies of her crew, the way some of them shifted uncomfortably, and some of them looked confused, and one or two of them looked almost hopeful, in a way they clearly did not want to admit. Humans were complicated. They had arrived on the galactic stage only 200 standard years ago, which made them practically newborns by the standards of species that had been traveling between stars for millennia. 200 years, they had built a military and economic presence that made much older civilizations deeply uneasy. The Galactic Council had granted them provisional membership, which was a polite way of saying, "We accept you, but we are watching you very carefully." And most species had opinions about humans that were a tangled mess of admiration and discomfort, and something that was not quite fear, but lived in the same neighborhood. They were persistence predators from a death world, which meant their biology was built for endurance and survival, in conditions that would kill most other species. And they could eat things that were poisonous to nearly everyone else, and survive injuries that would be fatal to a Valthari, and keep functioning without sleep for periods that Lysick called medically insane. But the thing that really unsettled people was their navy. The Terran Navy did not simply guard human space the way every other species guarded their own borders. They sent ships everywhere, into neutral corridors and empty sectors and the dark places between the spiral arms, where there was nothing of value and no reason for a warship to be. And when the Galactic Council formally protested this behavior, the humans had simply said, "Someone has to be out there," and kept doing it. Ruin cleared his throat, and the sound was like a small rock slide in the quiet cargo hold. "I have heard stories," he said, and his deep voice carried the weight of someone who had spent 40 years in deep space, and had learned to take spacer legends seriously. Ships that broke down in empty space and sent distress calls expecting to die, and then a human warship appeared, sometimes in hours, in places where no ship should have been for weeks, in any direction. "Stories," said Merchant Second Tovak, holding his youngest child against his chest. "Spacer bar talk, and nothing more." "Maybe," said Ruin, "but the crews I spoke to were not drunk, were not lying, and they described things that were hard to explain. Human ships that moved faster than their published specifications allowed. Human medics who treated species they had never seen before, using field manuals they had written themselves. Human engineers who repaired alien technology using tools and methods that should not have worked, but did. Because humans have a relationship with the concept of impossible that is different from everyone else's." Yethri shook her head. "The humans are impressive, I will not deny that. But they are not gods, and they cannot appear from nothing in the middle of the dead corridor. The nearest human system is 3 weeks away by fold drive." "Then we are dead," said someone in the back of the hold, and no one argued. The silence returned, heavier than before, and Yethri felt it pressing down on her like a physical weight, and she was about to speak, to say something meaningless about hope and patience and not giving up. Kind of things captains said when there was nothing real left to offer. When Lysick made a sound. It was a small sound, a sharp intake of breath through her spiracles, that was the Kethvari equivalent of a gasp, and Yethri turned to look at her, and saw that the young engineer was staring at her portable console, with her antenna standing perfectly straight and rigid, which was something Kethvari did when they encountered information that their brains could not immediately process. "Captain," Lysick said, and her voice was barely a whisper. "What is it?" "Something just pinged our beacon, an active return signal. Someone received our distress call, and they are responding. I am getting a tight beam transmission on a frequency I do not recognize. Every person in the cargo hold went still, and the only sound was the hum of the emergency power cells and the breathing of 15 souls who had just been handed something they were afraid to believe in. Moved to the console, her clawed feet clicking on the cold metal floor, and she looked at the data on Lysic's screen and saw that it was real. A focused communication beam aimed directly at the dawn petal from a source that was still too far away for their damaged sensors to identify. She opened the channel. The voice that filled the cargo hold was human, and it spoke Galactic Common with an accent that made the consonants harder and the vowels shorter. But every word was clear and precise, and delivered with a calm that bordered on mechanical. Vessel Dawn Petal. This is the Terran naval ship Erebus. Hull designation DDG-2271. We have your beacon. Hold position. We are inbound. ETA 4 hours. Confirm crew count and medical needs. Erebus actual. Out. The message ended. Nobody moved. Yethri stared at the console as if it had just spoken to her in a language that did not exist, and then she looked at Ruin and saw that the massive Gorvathi's hands were trembling. And she looked at Lysic, who was running calculations on her console with frantic speed, her forearms moving in a blur. "That is not possible," Lysic said. "The signal origin point indicates a vessel approximately 4 hours away at high fold speed, but the nearest human-controlled system is at minimum 3 weeks from our position. For a human ship to be 4 hours away, it would have had to be already out here in the dead corridor, patrolling empty space for no reason that makes any strategic or economic sense." Oshai, the young deckhand, laughed, and it was a wild, desperate sound that was half joy and half disbelief. "They are out here. They are actually out here. The stories are true." Tovak pulled his children closer, and his partner Mian pressed her face against his neck, and made a sound that might have been a sob or might have been a prayer. Ruin looked at Yethri with his old, sad, wise eyes and said one word. "How?" "Answer, because the math did not make sense, and the logic did not hold." And everything she knew about military strategy and resource allocation, and the cold equations of maintaining a fleet, said that no species would send warships to patrol empty nothing on the chance that someone might someday need help in a place where no one ever went. But the transmission was real, and the signal was real, and in 4 hours they would know whether the legends were true. She keyed the comm, and her voice was steady, even though her hands were not. "Terran naval ship Erebus, this is Captain Yethri Solen of the merchant vessel Dawn Petal. We have 15 souls aboard, including 3 children. 2 crew members are critically injured, 1 with severe radiation exposure. Our fold drive is destroyed, and our life support is failing. We are very glad to hear your voice." She released the transmit key, and the cargo hold was quiet again. But it was a different kind of quiet now. Silence of despair, but the silence of people holding their breath and waiting for a miracle. 4 hours and 11 minutes after the transmission, the Dawn Petal's proximity sensors screamed to life, and every alarm on the bridge fired at once. Captain Yethri Solen nearly fell out of her chair, because what had just happened was not supposed to be possible. A ship had dropped out of fold space less than 2 kilometers from their hull. 2 kilometers was nothing in space. It was close enough to spit at, and every navigation manual ever written by every species in the galaxy said that a fold exit should never be attempted closer than 50 kilometers to another vessel, because the margin for error was too thin, and the consequences of getting it wrong were a collision at speeds that would turn both ships into a cloud of superheated gas. Whoever was flying that ship either had the best navigation computer in the galaxy, or the kind of confidence that came from doing impossible things so many times they stopped feeling impossible. Flying across her console, pulling up sensor data, and what she saw made her go very still. The ship was small, at least compared to what Yethri had expected, a Terran Navy destroyer designated DDG-2271, roughly a third the size of a Galactic Council cruiser, and at first glance, it looked almost modest, a dark angular hull with none of the elegant curves that most species favored in their ship designs. But Lysick was reading the energy signatures, and her antennae were doing the rigid thing again. "Captain," she said quietly, "that ship is producing 3 times the power output of a vessel its size. The hull is layered with composite materials that my sensors cannot fully identify, and it is carrying weapons systems that are currently powered down, but the energy conduits feeding them are larger than our main engine." The destroyer hung in space beside them, like a predator that had chosen to be still, and even in its silence, it radiated something that Yethri could only describe as intent. This was not a ship that existed to look beautiful, or to impress diplomats. This was a ship that existed to do a job, and the job was violence if violence was required, and rescue if rescue was needed. And it did not much care which one you asked for. A boarding shuttle detached from the Erebus and crossed the gap between the 2 ships in minutes, and Yethri went to the airlock to meet it, with Ruin at her side, and her heart beating so hard she could hear it in her skull. The airlock opened, and humans stepped onto her ship. The first thing Yethri noticed was that they moved differently from any species she had met, not with the careful, deliberate movements of the Veltari, or the heavy, steady pace of the Gorvati, but with a kind of controlled energy that suggested they could go from standing still to sprinting in the time it took to blink. Every movement was efficient and purposeful, and they walked through the unfamiliar corridors of an alien ship, as if they had memorized the layout, which Yethri realized, with a start, they probably had. Commander Lena Vasquez was shorter than Yethri had expected, because humans were not a particularly large species compared to the galaxy's bigger inhabitants, but she filled the space around her in a way that had nothing to do with physical size. She had dark eyes that moved constantly, taking in details and cataloging threats and opportunities with a speed that was almost predatory. And when she smiled at Yethri, it was warm and genuine, but those eyes never stopped working. "Captain Solen," Vasquez said, extending her hand in the human greeting gesture that Yethri had read about but never experienced. "Commander Lena Vasquez, TNS Erebus, we are here to help." Behind her came 2 teams, one medical and one engineering, and they moved through the dawn petal with the kind of organized speed that only came from extensive training and preparation. Human called Dr. Ade Okonkwo, who was tall, even by human standards, with enormous, gentle hands, and a voice so soft that Yethri had to lean in to hear him. And he went straight to the medical bay, where the 2 injured crew members were lying in their bunks. And he examined them with instruments Yethri did not recognize, while reading from a datapad that he told her contained xenobiological treatment protocols for over 300 species. He had written most of them himself. When he reached Brecht, the Gorvathi engineer, with radiation poisoning, Okonkwo studied the readings for a long moment, and then began preparing a treatment that involved compounds Yethri had never heard of. And when she asked where he had learned to treat Gorvathi radiation exposure, he said he had spent the 4-hour transit studying Gorvathi physiology and designing a treatment protocol from first principles. 4 hours, he had learned an alien species biology well enough to save a life in 4 hours. He spoke to Brecht in broken but understandable Gorvathi, explaining each step of the treatment in a calm, steady voice. And Brecht, who had been resigned to dying, looked up at this strange, soft-spoken alien who had crossed the void to help him, and did not know what to say. The engineering team was led by a human called Senior Chief Petty Officer Kowalski, who was built like someone had compressed a normal person into a shorter, wider shape, and filled the extra space with muscle and stubbornness. And he examined the shattered fold drive with Lysick, and said very little for a long time. Then he turned to Lysick, and asked her questions about the drive specifications in technical language that Lysick later told Yethri was impressively precise for someone who had never worked on a Velthari engine before. And after 10 minutes of discussion, he sucked his teeth, which was apparently a human thinking gesture, and said, "It is wrecked, but I can rig a tow coupling. We can pull." He said this the way someone might say they could carry a bag of groceries, as if towing a ship many times the Erebus's mass across light years of space was simply a thing that needed doing, and therefore would be done. Yethri found Commander Vasquez on the bridge, studying the Dawn Petal's navigation logs, and she asked the question that had been burning in her mind since the transmission. "Commander, how were you here? This corridor is empty. There is nothing here, no strategic value, no trade routes, no reason for any military vessel to be within weeks of this position." Vasquez looked at her, and something moved behind those dark, calculating eyes, something that might have been sadness or might have been conviction. "We patrol the empty places, Captain. That is the point." Yethri pressed because she was a captain, and she was pragmatic, and she did not accept answers that did not make sense. And she told Vasquez that no military in the history of the galaxy had ever wasted resources patrolling corridors with zero strategic value, on the off chance that someone might need help. Vasquez listened politely, and did not argue, and did not explain further, and her silence was more unsettling than any answer could have been. Later Lysick pulled Yethri aside in the corridor, and spoke in a whisper. "Captain, I have been analyzing the Erebus's full drive signature from when it arrived, and it does not match any known human drive system in the galactic database. Their published specifications say their fastest ships can cross about 12 light-years per day, but based on my calculations, the Erebus covered the distance from the nearest human patrol route in 4 hours, which means their actual drive speed is at least 5 times faster than what they have told the Council." She paused, and her mandibles clicked nervously. "The humans have technology they are not sharing, technology that is generations ahead of what they have disclosed, and I do not know what that means, but it frightens me." Yethri thought about that as she walked through her ship, watching the humans work. In the cargo hold, Kowalski's engineering team was welding a tow coupling to the Dawn Petal's hull, and they worked in a rhythm that was almost musical, each person knowing exactly where to be and what to do without being told. And they had brought their own welding equipment and their own materials and their own power cells, because of course they had, because humans apparently packed for every possible scenario, including towing a crippled alien freighter through deep space. 6 hours after the Erebus arrived, the tow coupling was attached and the engineers were running final checks, and everything was almost ready. And Yethri had allowed herself for the first time to believe that they were actually going to survive this. And then Commander Vasquez's face changed. They were on the bridge together, going over the tow route, when Vasquez received a transmission through the small device she wore in her ear. And Yethri watched the human's expression go from calm to something else entirely. Not panic, because Yethri was beginning to understand that humans like Vasquez did not do panic, but a sharpening, a focusing, like a blade being turned edge on. "I need to return to my ship," Vasquez said, and her voice was exactly as steady as before, but there was something underneath it now. Something cold. "What is happening?" Yethri asked. 3 contacts just dropped out of fold space at the edge of our sensor range, running dark. No transponders, no identification, but we know the signatures. She paused. Vrakith. The word hit the bridge like a physical blow, and Ruin, who had been standing by the navigation console, made a sound deep in his chest that was the Gorvathi equivalent of a curse. The Vrakith were a nightmare that every spacer knew about, and prayed never to meet. A species that lived outside the Galactic Council's laws, and hunted disabled ships the way predators on 1,000 worlds hunted wounded prey. They did not negotiate, and they did not take prisoners in any meaningful sense of the word. They took cargo and fuel and stripped ships down to the hull. And the crews they captured were sold on black markets for purposes that no civilized species wanted to think about too carefully. They had been tracking the Dawn Petal's distress beacon, Yethri realized with a sickening lurch. The same beacon that had saved them had also been calling to something else in the dark. Vasquez was already moving toward the airlock when the Vrackith hail came through on an open channel, and the voice was harsh and clicking, and spoke galactic common badly, as if the language was something it had learned by force rather than by choice. Human warship and cargo vessel, you are in unclaimed space. Surrender the cargo ship and its crew and contents, and you may leave. You are outnumbered and outgunned. This is not a negotiation. Lysick had pulled up the sensor data, and what it showed made Yethri's blood go cold. 3 Vrackith ships, each one a heavy cruiser class, each one roughly 4 times the mass of the Erebus, bristling with weapons and armored with the thick brutal plating that the Vrackith favored, because their approach to ship design was the same as their approach to everything else. Blunt force applied without mercy. 3 heavy cruisers against 1 destroyer. Yethri had studied enough military history to know what those numbers meant. Screen where Vasquez's face appeared as the commander boarded her own ship, and Yethri expected to see what she would have felt in that moment. The cold calculation of someone measuring unwinnable odds. The grim mathematics of sacrifice and acceptable loss. Instead, Commander Lena Vasquez looked annoyed. Not frightened, not grim, not heroic, just annoyed. The way a person might look if they were trying to finish an important task, and someone kept interrupting them. Vasquez muted the Vrackith channel and spoke to Yethri directly. Captain Selene, I need you to seal your crew in the inner compartments and cut your external sensors. It is going to get bright out here. Commander, there are 3 of them, heavy cruisers. You cannot possibly. Captain, Vasquez said, and her voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that stopped Yethri mid-sentence. Seal your crew in. The comm screen showed Vasquez turning to her own bridge crew and issuing orders in rapid human language that Yethri could not follow. And the last thing Yethri saw before the feed cut was the Erebus's bridge lighting, shifting from standard white to a deep red that humans use to indicate combat readiness. And every human on that bridge was moving with the kind of calm, focused speed that said they had done this before. Yethri ordered her crew to the inner compartments, and Ruin gathered Tovok's children and carried the smallest one in his enormous arms. And the human sailor who had been playing cards with them helped herd the others, and gave Yethri a nod as he passed, that said more than words could have. Something like, we have done this before, and it will be all right, and this is what we are for. Lysick was supposed to cut the external sensors, but she did not. Instead, she routed a shielded feed to a portable console, and hid it under her thorax, and went to the inner compartment with everyone else, and sat in the corner, and watched what happened next. Through data alone, because she was an engineer, and engineers needed to know. The Erebus detached the tow coupling. The little destroyer accelerated away from the Dawn Petal, and the speed at which it moved was something Lysick would later describe in her personal log as a violation of everything I was taught about thrust-to-mass ratios, and it crossed the distance to the Vrackith formation in seconds. Vasquez hailed the Vrackith one final time, and her voice was broadcast on an open channel that the Dawn Petal's crew could hear in their sealed compartment. Vrackith vessels, this crew and this ship are under Terran naval protection. Withdraw now, or be destroyed. You will not be warned again. The Vrackith response was weapons fire, a barrage of plasma bolts and kinetic rounds from 3 heavy cruisers, converging on a single destroyer, enough firepower to crack a small moon. The Erebus did not try to dodge. It did something else, something that Lysick's sensors registered as a localized distortion in the fabric of spacetime itself. And the incoming fire bent around the ship like water around a stone. And then the Erebus fired back. Lysick watched her console, and tried to make sense of what she was seeing, but the data was coming too fast and too strange. Directed energy weapons that operated on frequencies her instruments could barely detect. Kinetic projectiles accelerated to a significant fraction of the speed of light. And something else. Something that registered on her gravitational sensors as a focused point of impossible density that appeared briefly inside the hull of the lead Vrackith cruiser. The lead cruiser broke apart from the inside. It did not explode in the conventional sense. It crumpled, as if a giant invisible hand had closed around it and squeezed. And the debris field expanded outward in a pattern that Lysick had never seen before and hoped never to see again. The second cruiser tried to run. It turned and fired its engines at maximum burn. And the Erebus pursued it with that terrible, impossible speed and hit it with a sustained beam that cut through its armored hull like the armor was not there. And the ship split in two, and each half tumbled away, trailing fire and atmosphere. The third cruiser fired everything it had at the Erebus in what must have been pure desperation, and some of it hit. Lysick saw the Erebus's forward hull take impacts that would have destroyed the Dawn Petal 10 times over, and the destroyer shuddered, but kept coming, and returned fire with a single concentrated burst that struck the third cruiser's reactor. The resulting explosion was bright enough that even inside the sealed inner compartment, with no windows, the crew of the Dawn Petal saw a flash of white light leak through the seams of the bulkhead doors. Then silence. Lysick stared at her console, and the timestamp told her that the entire engagement from first shot to last had taken 7 minutes. 7 minutes, 3 heavy cruisers, a single destroyer. The comm crackled, and Vasquez's voice filled the compartment, exactly as calm as it had been 6 hours ago, when she first stepped onto the Dawn Petal, as if she had not just done what she had done. "All clear, Captain. We will re-establish the tow. Slight delay. Apologies for the inconvenience." Apologies for the inconvenience. Yethri looked around the compartment at her crew, at Ruin, whose massive hands were trembling, at Lysick, who was staring at her console with the blank expression of someone whose understanding of the universe had just been rewritten, at Tovak's children, who were still playing the card game the human sailor had taught them, oblivious and laughing, because children lived in a world where grown-ups handled the scary things, and everything always turned out all right. She looked at the bulkhead, and beyond it, in her mind, at the small battered destroyer that was already moving back toward them to reconnect the tow line, the ship that had just destroyed 3 cruisers, 4 times its size, in 7 minutes, using weapons that should not exist. 36 hours later, the Dawn Petal was docked at Velen Station, and Captain Yethri Selen stood on the observation deck, watching her crew being escorted to the station's medical facility. And for the first time in 4 days, she allowed herself to breathe without counting how many breaths she had left. They were alive. All 15 of them, including Brecht, the Gorvathi engineer, whose radiation poisoning had been not just halted, but reversed by Dr. Okonkwo's improvised treatment. A treatment that the station's own medical staff examined with expressions of open disbelief, because it used a combination of compounds and techniques that no one in the galactic medical community had ever tried before. And it worked better than anything in the official literature. Okonkwo had simply shrugged when the station doctors asked him how he had developed the protocol, and said he had read everything available on Gorvathi cellular biology during the 4-hour transit there. And when they pointed out that 4 hours was not enough time to develop a novel radiation treatment, he had smiled his quiet smile and said that it had been a long 4 hours. Tovak's children had not wanted to leave the Erebus, which was something Yethri had not expected, and the smallest one had cried and clung to the Hunan sailor who had taught them card games, until the sailor knelt down and gave the child his battered deck of cards, and said something in his own language that made the child laugh through the tears. Yethri found Commander Vasquez in the station's docking bay, where the Erebus was undergoing minor repairs to the forward hull damage it had sustained during the battle. And Kowalski was overseeing the work with the same unbothered competence he brought to everything, patching holes in a warship's armor the way someone else might patch a hole in a fence. Yethri had prepared a speech. In Veltari culture, when someone saved your life, you owed them a debt bond that was sacred and binding, a formal acknowledgement that your continued existence belonged in part to the one who had preserved it, and the debt could be repaid through service or goods or loyalty, but it could never be ignored. And Yethri had spent an hour choosing the right words, because what Vasquez and her crew had done went beyond anything the debt bond tradition was designed to cover. She delivered the speech, and it was good and formal, and it honored the humans properly. And then she offered the debt bond in the traditional way, with her crest lowered and her hands open. Vasquez listened to the entire speech with respect and attention, and then she shook her head. "No debt, Captain. This is what we do." Yethri had expected this, because she was beginning to understand something about humans, and she pressed forward with the question she had really come to ask, the question that had been growing inside her since the moment a calm voice answered, her distress beacon from a place where no voice should have been. Why? She asked it plainly and without diplomacy, because she was too tired and too grateful for games. Why do humans send warships into empty corridors where nothing lives and nothing moves, and there is no strategic value, and no profit, and no glory? Why did you risk your ship and your crew against 3 heavy cruisers for a cargo hauler full of strangers you had never met? Why are you out here in the dark? Commander Vasquez was quiet for a long time. She leaned against the railing of the docking bay and looked out at the stars through the station's viewport. And Yethri watched her face and saw something there that she had not seen before. Not the calculating focus of a military officer, or the controlled calm of a commander in battle, but something older and deeper, something that looked like it had been carried for a very long time. "Captain," Vasquez said, and her voice was different now, softer, more human, in a way that Yethri could feel but not define. Humanity spent most of its history on a single world, a small blue planet orbiting an ordinary star, and that world was mostly covered in water, an ocean so vast that for thousands of years we could not cross it. She paused. People got lost on that ocean. Ships sank in storms. Sailors drifted for weeks without food or water. And they lit fires, and flew flags, and fired cannons into the air, hoping that someone would see, hoping that someone would come. And sometimes someone did, and sometimes no one did. And the ones who are never found, they haunted us. They became part of who we were, the knowledge that it was possible to call for help and hear nothing but silence. Vasquez turned to look at Yethri directly, and her dark eyes were bright with something fierce. When we finally built ships that could cross that ocean, we made rules, laws, traditions. If you heard a distress signal, you answered it. It did not matter if the ship was an enemy or a stranger, or someone you despised. If they were drowning, you pulled them out of the water. Because we knew what it meant to drown. We knew what the silence sounded like. She straightened up. And then we reached the stars, and the ocean got bigger, so much bigger, and the silence got deeper, and we looked out at all of that emptiness, and we made a promise to ourselves, a promise that is older than our government, and older than our military, and older than any treaty we have ever signed. Her voice was steady and certain in the way that only true things could be. No one calls for help in the dark, and gets silence. Not anymore, not if we can reach them. The galaxy is very big, Captain, and the dark is very deep, but someone has to answer. Yethri stood there and felt the words settle into her bones the way warmth settled into cold hands, slowly and completely. And she understood something that she suspected the Galactic Council would never understand, that the humans were not patrolling the void because they were aggressive or expansionist, or because they wanted to project power into neutral space. They were out there because they remembered what it felt like to drown. Vasquez shook Yethri's hand one more time and smiled. A real smile this time, without the calculating edges. And then she walked back to her ship, and her crew filed in after her. The medics and the engineers and the sailors who played card games with alien children. And the Erebus sealed its hatches and powered up its impossible drive. Yethri watched from the observation deck as the destroyer detached from the station and turned toward the void. Ruin appeared beside her the way he always did, quietly and without announcement. And they stood together and watched the Erebus accelerate into the darkness. "Where do you think they are going?" Ruin asked. "Somewhere empty," Yethri said. "One else, patrols. Somewhere someone might need them." The Erebus's drive flared once, a brief, brilliant point of light against the infinite dark, and then it was gone. 6 weeks later, the Dawn Petal's cargo of medical supplies reached the plague-stricken colony on the fringe of Council space, delivered by a repair crew that Vasquez had arranged before she left, because of course she had. And the medicine arrived 3 days before the colony's medical system would have collapsed entirely, and 11,000 lives were saved. Captain Yethri Selen filed her official report with the Galactic Council, and it was thorough and detailed, and it described everything: the rescue and the battle and the weapons that should not exist, and the drive technology that was generations ahead of anything the humans had disclosed. And she ended the report with a recommendation that she knew would make powerful people uncomfortable. The Council continues to debate whether humanity's military presence in neutral space constitutes a threat. I would suggest the Council consider a different question. What happens in the corridors where the humans are not? The report was received and reviewed and noted and filed in the Council archives, where it joined hundreds of similar reports from dozens of species, all describing the same impossible thing: a human warship appearing in the emptiness where no ship should be, answering a call that no one expected anyone to hear. The Council did nothing, because the Council was very good at doing nothing. And the debate about human military overreach continued in the same circular way it always had. And the diplomats argued, and the politicians postured, and the committees produced reports about the reports. But in the ports and stations and ships scattered across the galaxy, the story spread the way all true stories spread, not through official channels, but through the voices of people who had been there. Other spacers over drinks in crowded bars. Merchants whispering to other merchants in the loading bays of trade stations. Children telling other children about the strange kind aliens who played cards and gave away chocolate and came out of nowhere to save the day. Another legend, another tale of a signal answered from the dark. And deep in the void, in the vast silence between the stars, where no trade routes ran, and no patrols were scheduled, and no sane military would ever waste its resources, another human warship moved quietly through the nothing, its sensors sweeping the empty frequencies, its crew awake and ready, its weapons cold but waiting.